late at night. An Airbus A330 carrying 306 passengers and crew unexpectedly runs out of fuel when halfway over the Atlantic Ocean. The lights go off, the oxygen masks come off, and the engines give way to a spooky, pitch-black quiet. The enormous airplane starts to float into the water below. Startled, the pilots try to glide the aircraft as far as they can. The flight attendants get the passengers ready for what is probably a death sentence for everyone on board, an emergency ditching in the ocean. Though it's unbelievable that it never had to happen in the first place, this is a living nightmare. The technical details of this tragedy are often the focus of stories, yet that tells only half the narrative. In actuality, this is a really interesting tale about human behavior. It tells the tale of how individuals, under duress and with conflicting facts, make judgments. This is the Flight 236 tale from Air Transat. An Air Transat Airbus A330 carrying 293 passengers and 13 crew members took off from Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada on the evening of August 23, 2001. They had 7 hours to go to Lisbon, Portugal. While many Portuguese nationals were returning home, the majority of passengers were vacationers eager to spend a few weeks in Portugal's sunny climate. Little did they know when they boarded the aircraft that night that a critical weakness in one of the engines would put them in serious danger. Halfway across the Atlantic, the passengers should not have been concerned at first glance. With hundreds of onboard sensors and banks of computers providing information to the pilots, the Airbus A330 was a state-of-the-art aircraft. With its highly automated systems, it had established itself as one of the safest aircraft in the sky since its debut 7 years earlier. This flight was being conducted on an airplane that was only 2 years old. When he was a pilot, Captain Robert P.C., then 48, was in charge of the trip. He had logged more than 16,000 hours of flight time in a diverse range of aircraft, including both land and seaplanes in Canada's frigid north. But he had an uncommon background for an airline pilot. He had been arrested smuggling marijuana into the United States in a tiny plane and had served 16 months of a 5-year jail term before being hired by Air Transat. However, the disaster that would transpire across the seas on this particular night would surpass anything in this remarkable career. First Officer Dirk Diego, who is 28 years old, joined PC in the cockpit. Of the approximately 5,000 hours he had flown, just roughly 400 were on the A330. Even though he didn't have as much experience as the captain, he had also seen a lot of other kinds of aircraft before doing Air Transat's Airbus flight school a year earlier. The pilot's training and performance histories with the airline were impeccable. After every passenger had boarded Flight 236, and the aircraft had been loaded with 48 metric tons of fuel for the Atlantic journey. Pushback from the gate, Toronto. As of 9 p.m. local time, they anticipated arriving in Lisbon within around 7 hours. When the captain taxied out to the runway and started the engines for departure, everything went according to plan. After taking off, the pilots turned the aircraft toward the east and ascended to a cruising height of 39,000 feet. For the initial several hours, everything was going smoothly. Since they were expected to arrive in Lisbon early in the morning, the passengers made themselves comfortable. There is hardly much for the pilots to do in the cockpit during long-haul flights. This is a copy of the checklist that the pilots used for this trip. Since there is no radar over the oceans, their key responsibilities were monitoring the aircraft systems, comparing the fuel quantity to the flight plan, and reporting position reports to air traffic control. For the first 4 hours, everything in the cockpit went as usual. The pilots received an odd indication concerning engine number 2 as the aircraft raced across the Atlantic, but just after 5 in the morning GMT, when the flight was almost halfway over the ocean, the onboard computers alerted the crew to 3 problems with the engine on the right side of the aircraft: low oil amount, low oil temperature, and excessive oil pressure. This particular mix of warnings was new to the pilots. The temperature of the engine oil usually rises during flying. They stay upright. The pilots examined the flight crew operating handbook to see if they could uncover any information on the strange readings. However, none of the manuals had any information that may account for this combination of symptoms. They radioed the Air Transat Maintenance Control Center in Mirabel, Quebec, back in Canada, after their search produced no results. When they informed the dispatcher about the strange symptoms, he promised to investigate and get back to them. The pilots kept an eye on the passenger compartment and the engine signals throughout the interim. No signs of difficulty were present. Many of the travelers were dozing off. They would be rudely awakened in a few seconds. After half an hour, precisely at 5:30 a.m. GMT, an advisory message was shown on the ECOM, the cockpit's central monitor. When the pilots saw the whole ECAM page, they observed an imbalance in fuel between the left and right wing tanks. Although odd, a fuel imbalance usually does not warrant concern. In order to remedy the situation, the pilots opened the crossfeed valve, allowing gasoline to transfer from the left tank to the right tank of the aircraft. Nevertheless, the instruments showed that the total amount of gasoline on board had fallen below the level needed to reach Lisbon just 10 minutes after the pilots had taken this action. Things were beginning to become serious now. They were unable to reach Europe as they were halfway over the Atlantic. The pilots had few alternatives for diversion airports over the middle of the Atlantic. The airport in the Azores Islands, a tiny group of Portuguese islands in the midst of the Atlantic, was actually their only choice. They diverted owing to a fuel deficit and set course for the major airport on the island of Terceira, notifying Santa Maria Air Traffic Control. The aircraft only had 7 tons of fuel left on board at this moment. Even though it only makes up 6% of the A330's overall fuel capacity, this is still a significant drop from normal. The crew was in a terrible scenario if the fuel figures were accurate. The quick pace and slight loss displayed on the instruments were totally compatible with a significant gasoline leak. The pilots, however, didn't think there was a gasoline leak. First of all, nothing had transpired during the trip to warrant the aircraft's fuel leak to begin with. Nothing happened. No loud noises, no intense turbulence, no lightning strikes, etc. For the first 4 hours, there had been no abnormal fuel usage. How on earth could a brand new A330 suddenly begin to lose fuel in the middle of the calmest part of the flight? Second, the flight attendants had been requested by the captain to see whether any fluid was trailing back from the engines or the wings, but they had not discovered any. Ultimately, the fuel loss rate was so high, literally a metric ton of gasoline every 5 minutes, that it appeared improbable that there would be just 7 tons remaining halfway across the Atlantic. Up until then, every fuel check was entirely typical. It was almost beyond comprehension. The pilots came to the conclusion that the likelihood of the fuel estimates being inaccurate was much higher. In fact, leaks on passenger aircraft are so uncommon that neither pilot received any instruction at all on how to recognize and handle them. In the case of a fuel leak, there is a checklist. Other than the fact that this is a photocopy of the one the pilots of Flight 236 had with them at the time, the pilots were just unprepared to interpret the issues they were observing as a fuel leak. Furthermore, they had already come to the general conclusion that, in a complex aircraft such as the A330, the signs they got earlier in the flight about the engine oil were probably a mistake. It is not unheard of for defective sensors to produce inaccurate data. Therefore, the pilots believed that the fuel indicators were inaccurate when they noticed that they were displaying, to put it bluntly, incredibly low fuel levels. Of course, the unfortunate reality is that the pilots were correct to believe there was a connection between the fuel level and engine oil signs. Unbeknownst to the pilots, however, a significant fuel leak in the right-hand engine was the common element that explained both of them rather than a computer fault. Fuel was exploding at an alarming pace into engine number 2 as a result of a vibrating hydraulic line deep within the engine rubbing through a fuel pipe's outer casing. The strange-looking engine oil and low gasoline signals had both come from this source. This was a major instance of confirmation bias, a psychological phenomena. The crew first believed that malfunctioning sensors were the cause of the engine oil warnings. When creating a mental model or representation of the world, humans behave more like attorneys than scientists. Instead of looking for facts that could only corroborate their position, they search for proof that strengthens it. The pilots failed to step back and reassess their original theory despite mounting signs of a fuel leak, including the fuel imbalance and the fast fuel loss warnings. Psychology is well aware of how potent this phenomena is when faced with stress and a heavy workload. The pilots had little chance to reassess their comprehension of the situation because they were too busy interacting with maintenance control, following checklists, and arranging the diversion with the cabin crew and air traffic control. The disparity between the two tanks persisted even after gasoline was being fed from the left tank into the right tank minutes earlier. The plane was actually losing gasoline at an astounding pace. Nevertheless, given the Airbus A330's high degree of automation, the pilots found it difficult to accept that there was a fuel leak for the previously stated reasons. The pilots were not informed of the gasoline leak by any warning. They would have to keep an eye on each tank's rate of gasoline loss in order to ascertain this. To change the direction of the crossfeed and use gasoline from the right wing tank to feed both engines, the pilots turned the right wing fuel pumps on and the left wing fuel pumps off, just in case there was a fuel leak in the right wing. Subsequently, the crew notified the Air Transat Maintenance Control Center of the mysteriously low fuel indicators once more. The aircraft should have had 17 tons of gasoline on board, but at this point it only had 4.8 tons. The gasoline supply was decreasing while they were speaking with maintenance control. The captain finally made the decision not to execute the fuel leak operation, even though the pilots had discussed it. This was because the pilots had to drop to 20,000 feet as part of the operation. If there were leaks, the captain reasoned, it would be disastrous to descend since running out of fuel at their present high altitude of 39,000 feet was far better than running out of fuel at 20,000 feet, which was almost half of their current height. Within the psychology of solving problems, the framing bias in risk-averse decision-making is a phenomena that explains the captain's decision to forego this operation. Individuals frequently present their alternatives in terms of profits and losses. In this instance, the captain had to decide between a certain loss, descending to 20,000 feet, and a less likely but nonetheless catastrophic loss, staying at 39,000 feet and failing to identify a fuel leak. In these circumstances, people are more likely to go for the riskier option. According to the logic, it's preferable for a horrible thing to maybe occur than for something relatively awful to occur. However, the right-hand engine's flameout at 6:13 a.m. eliminated any doubts moments later. With only one engine operating, the captain promptly engaged the remaining engine to its greatest thrust and started the descent. At 39,000 feet, the plane could still fly, but not much. Air traffic control was informed by the first officer that they were descending and had lost an engine. The crew's remaining fuel weight was only 600 kilos at this moment. The airport was still 240 kilometers away. The pilots eventually realized that they were indeed facing a life-or-death scenario. Air traffic control was notified of an emergency by the first officer. Subsequently, after 13 minutes and 120 kilometers away from the airport, the left-hand engine caught fire. Now all that remained of one of the most advanced technical aircraft in the sky was a massive glider. The plane has lost electrical power due to the failure of both engines. The ram air turbine, a fan that spins in the wind, automatically deploys from beneath the fuselage of the aircraft. It produced a little quantity of electrical power that was utilized to power a few other vital systems, including the captain's instruments. Stretching the glide as far as possible in the hopes of making the airport was the captain's only responsibility. All 293 passengers' lives were in jeopardy. The loss of electrical power had thrown the passenger compartment into complete darkness, and the absence of engines created an unsettling quiet. The flight attendants were instructed by the captain to get the passengers ready for a water landing. As there was no way to see the water coming up to meet them, it was essentially a death sentence for everyone on board at night. A crash landing in the ocean would rip the aircraft apart because to the large swells in the Atlantic, and any occupants who were not slain by the impact forces would probably drown. The decision that appeared to Captain Pike to be between ditching in the water and attempting to glide to the airport was actually a false one. Since the few people who survived the initial crash would quickly die to hypothermia, glide to the airport, it was his only hope. But this was no simple undertaking, especially with almost 100 kilometers to go with it being nighttime. At its present height of 30,000 feet, the plane was descending at a speed of 2,000 feet per minute. This implied that the jet will crash in 15 minutes, come hell or high water. Captain PJ had complete control over whether it ended up on the runway or in the sea. Without engines to provide the cabin with air, it was starting to lose pressure. The oxygen mask dropped, and the travelers hurried to quickly put them on. The oxygen masks are also put on by the pilots. Although the captain had performed engine-out landings in smaller planes before, this assignment was unlike anything he had ever done. Nightfall had fallen. He was 100 kilometers away from the airport, and the A330 is not exactly a smooth ride, as in every passenger aircraft. In addition to propelling the aircraft forward, The engines also provide hydraulic and electrical power. Numerous critical systems have failed due to the loss of both engines. Initially, the aircraft had 2 out of its 3 hydraulic systems destroyed. They provide power to the tailplane stabilizer, which makes it more difficult for the captain to regulate the plane's pitch. In addition, the majority of the wing spoilers, nose wheel steering, and engine thrust reversers had been removed from the aircraft. Stated differently, not only did the plane lose its engine power, but it also became more difficult to maneuver while in the air. It would also be more difficult to maneuver and stop if PJ were to make it to the runway. The tower controller started to switch on and off the runway lights at the airport to indicate to the pilots where the airport was. It was visible to the crew alone, far off on the horizon, a bright spot in the otherwise black Atlantic Ocean. The skipper flew the descent at a speed halfway between the suggested light speed and the stall warning speed in order to maintain the aircraft in the air as long as feasible. On approach, he could easily drop faster to lose speed if he found himself too high, but if he ended up too low, there would be no way to regain that height. During the fall, he sought to maintain as much height as possible. However, there were a couple additional limitations he needed to deal with. He needed to maintain a speed over 140 knots, failing which the ram air turbine would cease to produce energy simultaneously. There was no speed limit of 200 knots, otherwise the landing gear would not extend for him. Furthermore, he could only adjust his airspeed by pitching the nose up or down behind him, because he was gliding. There were 293 passengers getting ready to ditch into the water. They were shown how to assume the brace posture by the flight attendants. As the minutes passed, there was an absolute silence in the cabin. The captain realized that his attempts to maintain the aircraft's altitude had been successful, but not effective enough, as they approached the airport. And a fresh issue had emerged. The aircraft was too aloft. He was still at 13,000 feet and 8 miles away. By now, he should have reached roughly 3,000 feet on a typical approach. Approaching at this location would force him to fall rapidly, increasing his velocity to the point where a landing might be feasible. PJ found it unsettling that he had to put some distance between himself and the runway due to the lack of engine power. He turned around in a full circle to reduce height. The first officer stretched the slats at the front of the wings and dropped the gear during this maneuver. Because of the increased lift they produced, the aircraft was able to fly slower without creating excessive drag. This turn was a disconcerting move. The jet was looking away from the airport for the better part of it. After 2.5 minutes, the runway was once again visible as the captain leveled the wings. He wasn't high enough to perform a second 360-degree rotation, even though he was still elevated. Because of this, he attempted to increase the distance between himself and the runway by making a series of maneuvers as he got closer to the airport, backing the aircraft hard to the left and then hard to the right. As every rescue vehicle in the fleet was sent to meet the aircraft on the runway, ambulances and fire departments stood near the runway, ready for the fully laden A330 to crash land. The first officer kept a close eye on the aircraft's airspeed, while the skipper conducted the last approach. Without flaps, they had to maintain a far greater airspeed than typical, roughly 200 knots as opposed to the typical 145 knots. As the runway approached them, the first officer helped the captain by yelling out airspeeds and elevations. There would be no missed approaches or go-rounds. Only had one opportunity to land the aircraft on the runway. The plane finally made a hard landing on the runway. After 8 of the 12 tires exploded, the aircraft bounced before crashing again. The plane was traveling at a very high speed, and it wasn't slowing down even without most of its wing spoilers and engine reverse thrust. Furthermore, the anti-skid mechanism was not working. Thus, the wheels locked up when the captain used the brakes forcefully. Now the huge airplane was sliding along the runway. The tires have worn all the way to the rim. The plane finally slid to a halt after making a screaming landing. Every passenger, 306 in total, was safe. After the pilot gave the order to evacuate, every passenger was able to get off the aircraft in less than 90 seconds. There were fires that began in the left main gear wheels, but the firefighters who were waiting to assist the aircraft quickly put them out. The team was first greeted with a hero's welcome. Without a single fatality, they had executed the longest glide of a passenger plane in aviation history. Nevertheless, a few days after the landing, regarding how the pilots ran out of fuel over the Atlantic in the first place, questions were raised. When their equipment told them that the gasoline was draining far quicker than usual, why didn't they believe them? Investigators concluded that the pilots would have landed at Larges with at least 3.8 metric tons of fuel on board if they had followed any of the fueling procedures, engine fueling, wing fueling, or fuel leak not located, when they started the diversion to Las Vegas. However, the pilots never executed these procedures because of psychological reasons, including confirmation bias and framing bias that were already covered in this episode, in addition to the A330 software's lack of a few last warnings. The fact that Air Transat had not provided them with any training did not assist. Few leaks and the processes involved. Investigators discovered that the number 2 engine had undergone repair not long before the disaster, which may have been the initial cause of the gasoline leak. Takeoff. An engine component that was intended for a different aircraft had been swapped out by a technician. As a result, on Flight 236, a hydraulic line had come into touch with a fuel tube. A huge fuel leak resulted from the hydraulic line rupturing the fuel tube as it vibrated and strained on it. The final assessment commended the pilots for their handling of the situation after the engines failed, even if it acknowledged that their inability to detect the gasoline leak in time contributed to the aircraft running out of fuel. This is a sample taken from the completed report. Given the stressful nature of the circumstance, the captain's management of the aircraft during the engine-out descent and landing was impressive as they approached the landing. Nightfall had fallen. A couple of instruments were at hand. His pitch control was restricted, and he was not trained for this kind of flying profile. The statement continued, stating that the captain received complete and efficient assistance from the first officer during the engine-out glide and smooth landing. The Airline Pilots Association presented PC and Yeager with the Superior Airman Chip, award the year following the event in honor of their exceptional proficiency in performing a dead-stick landing of an Airbus A330. They continue to retain the record for the longest passenger airplane glide. In response to this occurrence, Airbus updated its flight management computer to include a warning that alerts pilots in the event of a high fuel loss rate, perhaps indicating a gasoline leak. In addition, Air Transat gave its pilots more instruction in fuel management, diversion techniques, and extended range operations. The PC and Yeager's record glide is probably going to stand as a record for a very long time because of these safety enhancements. I would want to express my gratitude to YouTubers and Patreon backers for making this video possible. If you liked this video, please think about giving the channel a monthly donation of only $3. The URLs to them are displayed here on the screen. I would especially want to express my gratitude to Joey and Steve Wilcox for their kind assistance. There is now a Discord server for Green Park Aviation. I'll see you there if you click on the link in the video description and want to be a part of the expanding community of individuals talking about anything related to aviation. Once again, I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you soon for the next episode.